And we are live. It's another live stream from Cribble. So glad to be here today. This is Ed Bailey with Perry Correll, aka Dr. Observability. How you doing, Perry?
I'm doing real well, Ed. This is I was looking forward to this. As we were just talking about, we're both living in an area that's got beautiful weather today, so why not just hop on a live webinar and kind of talk about what's going on? But Ed, as you said, you and I, we were on a call a little while back, and it was so much fun. Time to do another one.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fun series. I think it's just great to talk about what is observability. Why does it matter? Why should you spend time on it? I think this is, really it's a great conversation. For anyone who's listening, please don't hesitate to ask questions. We're monitoring the various uh, Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, LinkedIn and YouTube YouTube chat channels. So more than happy to engage. Always happy to answer questions. We're always here to help. So Perry, tell us what are we doing today? What are we going to talk about?
Okay, kind of goes back to what you just said. Okay, that's our pretty pictures there.
There we go.
We're looking good, but on the previous one we kind of talked about, and one of the things you just mentioned, what is observability, and it's kind of fun to have that discussion. And some people get argumentative about it because it really isn't defined. And one of the things I like to kind of make fun of is there's no ISO or IEEE or IETF standard for observability. So I don't want to say it's whatever you want it to be, but different people have different ideas of what it is. And as we discussed previously, is that a recent study talked about how important it was, but then 60% of that people in the study said they weren't actually sure what it is. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, because the last time you and I were on a call, it was like, okay, let's start at the very, very beginning of why bother? Why bother go down the path? What are the business values? And we kind of talked to them pretty good. And anybody listening today, if you haven't seen it, that recording is up there too. But now we kind of want to talk about what is the architecture, what forms what we are calling observability. And there's a lot of different components. I mean, this is something that I put together kind of just to get us to talk from, because I know we all hate PowerPoints. And just to let everybody know, this is the one slide. We're not going to go through 40 slides of it. We're going to talk about this. And, what do you think of this slide? Is what's missing? What isn't highlighted enough? Or what do you think?
Well, I think the first thing you got to start with is, we talked about the why, we talked about why it matters, and now I think we got to start with requirements. What are you interested in? What do you care about? And then start with this slide, because that is a key thing. You always start from the left, and it's all about data. But first off is requirements. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And as obviously,
Mhm.
nobody else knows right now, but we were talking not 5, 6, 7 minutes ago about that exact same thing. Is that when you're talking about observability, where do you start? And most people, the first thing they'll say is it's the data. But actually, it's before that. It's before what data are you looking for? And that's like, what are you trying to accomplish? You've got a lot of stakeholders or a lot of investigators there along the top line. And that's not all of them. I mean, you go up a level and you get CISOs and CIOs and all that stuff. But why are we going down this path? What are we trying to find out? And in many cases, those five teams across the top, they have overlapping responsibilities, but they have specific things they target at.
Yeah, it's very true, and that's all why it's so important when to define your strategy. I see this quite a bit when I talk to customers. Is everyone has good intentions, everyone's trying to move forward, but there's a lack of a clearly articulated strategy across the organization about what are we doing, the why, how, and how we're going to proceed. And that's why I think it's critically important, because you're not going to be able to solve this problem across all five of these verticals at one time. That's just not possible. And so it's important for organizations to have a strategy, have a plan, and pick where you're going to start. And I urgently recommend people think about starting on your fifth biggest problem, because you have to get your processes ready. So and the thing is, you want to start with your biggest problem, because the conquering the data and getting everything set up is going to be a lot harder, because if it's your biggest problem, the complexity of dealing with the problem is going to be much worse. So get your processes right, get your teams right, get your training right, and then work your ladder up the way up to your big problems. Does that make sense, Perry?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, and I hadn't thought about it quite in
Mhm.
the way you did, but I don't want to kind of say it's like go after low hanging fruit, but maybe go after the things that you you have a good chance resolving easily. Where some of this stuff is going to go, some of these challenges are going to go across your entire enterprise and cover a lot of different organizations, a lot of different stakeholders that they're all going to have to get involved. Now, in your previous life, you looked over multiple groups, had multiple different responsibilities. And when somebody came to you and said, hey, I need this new system, whether it's a SIM or APM or whatever it is, would you push back on them and say, why? What are you trying to accomplish?
You're absolutely, you have to say, the first question has to be why, and why do I care? Why does my boss care? Why does the company care? And it separates, it's very, very not unusual for say, hey, we have a technical problem, we need to solve it, where actually you need to have a business problem. Because, for example, if I took a technical problem to my business leader who's going to fund this is going to ask, why do I care? And if it's not a technical problem that impacts the business, he's going to like, why should I fund this? Why do I care? And that's why this is something we've talked about before. When you're trying to make project requests, is you have to put it in the language of the business. And why, are we aligned with the business's strategy to move forward? Just being a technical problem doesn't mean it's worth solving.
That's interesting. I
Mhm.
just mentioned a little before, I came out of aerospace in a while, and one of the things that they used to say a lot about of a lot of young engineers
Mhm.
coming into the company, they'll come in with a solution looking for a problem.
Yeah.
And if they don't figure, what are the problems we have that we need to deal with first? And it's two ways you can look at that. One is, are these big number one problems, are they critical problems? Are there something that we have to do something today? Or to your point, is it something that we can, smaller fixes can actually help that and move that whole thing along?
Right. And my comment about starting with your fifth biggest problem, actually, I would probably change that to your 10th biggest problem, because it's important as a project stakeholder to give feedback. And you want to be able to give feedback to your boss with a concept of, okay, we've got to have our muscle memory of how to handle this, and that we can make it repeatable. Because in any company, if you can solve observability for one application, what about the next application, the next application? And that's why that feedback loop has to be shorter, because a lot of times the companies, they just don't have the patience for an extended project to basically wait a year for results. And that's why starting with smaller applications, less important applications, is a way to give feedback, is a way to say, hey, it's a smaller application, but here's what we did, here's the results, and here's how long it took. And that gives you a way to ask your boss for more support and more funding, because it's just you're getting feedback faster. And that's a methodology I found to be pretty successful.
Yeah, and part of that too is, in your little discussion there, you just mentioned loop like four times, and I
Mhm,
think that's key to kind of look at this, because
mhm.
I kind of say observability is a journey, and you're never going to get there because it is a loop.
Right.
The industry is constantly changing. The solutions are, the data is changing, the requirements are changing, governance is changing, and so it's, once you get one thing resolved, I don't even, resolve might even be the wrong.
Right.
Once you get one thing addressed, that might help in other areas, and keep going around and keep, maybe as you look at it, I'm keeping tweaking stuff instead of making major, major changes. And once again, unless it's a critical invite there, and it is, you're constantly making better and better and better and making improvements along the lines. And as you can see, we've got 30 different things on this page that you can address, and each one of them has constant changes occurring to them.
Absolutely, and especially when you're looking at modern application systems, that's where principles of game theory, organizational behavior come in, because it's just as you said, you're never done. And that's why it's important, and when you're building out a project timeline for something like this, that you have your minimal viable product, that we're going to be able to deliver a certain amount of value for phase one, and we're going to deliver a little bit more value in phase two, so that we keep having that iteration over and over again to lift up the organization overall. But but that's all. But it's also critical to set the expectation that we're never going to be at 100%.
No, that's a great point.
Mhm.
And one of the things I kind of mentioned there too is that the I guess we didn't fit governance in there. Six letters kind of works pretty good, but that is also, and if you look at that from a federal standpoint, a legal standpoint,
Right.
and a corporate standpoint. Those are going to also be constant flux, and will require changes pretty much everywhere else you're doing. Obviously, every given day and stuff, you hear about some security threat or whatever, and obviously security is always going to be in my mind, an overriding concern of your observability architecture. I want to know what happened, when happened, why it happened,
Right.
and the the threats. What's going to continue a process? It's unbelievable.
Right. And those are just things to keep in mind as you get better. So let's go kind of circle back in terms of governance and requirements and project planning, because you're right, it does start with data, but you first have to pick what kind of data. And that's also where I think starting to document broadly, because and that's another thing I've seen people run into is they start to document requirements for all their data and all their applications. I've seen companies with 600, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 applications. If you try to take that approach, hell will freeze over before you're done defining your requirements. And so it is, so that's another thing where you want to prioritize. Start with your top 50 and then work from there. I mean, I saw a project for a cloud transformation and said, "Oh, we got 1,000 applications. We'll get 1,000 applications and move to AWS in 3 years." I couldn't. I had to be. You know, it's just not going to happen.
Let's pick
So
10.
yeah, let's pick 10. Exactly. But you get that muscle memory right, and then you plan as you move along. And so, but define, so like, for example, you start with your network team and interview process of, okay, for your routers, for your firewall gear, for this, establish that high level baseline for your applications. I mean, I like to call it gold signal. And then that's also where you pick your top, 20, 50 applications. Like, do we have the golden signal? And then that helps you prioritize, because say 20 out of your 50 have the golden signals that you want. You start there, and then you send requests to the dev teams for your other applications to add the golden signals to their applications. And so and it's all about, you have all these spinning balls, tops, and plates that are in the air as you juggle this process and expand across your application.
You also made me think of something else. I love talking to you because things
Mhm.
come up when you're talking with prospects in a consulting role and whatever. Do people do enough documenting? Do they actually make a plan, put it down on paper, get an idea, or do they go off more half-cocked? And maybe it's the size of the organization and rules they have that defining that stuff ahead of time and putting it on a piece of paper with a team and whatever might actually help you make the right decisions at the beginning. Going back to what you said is that, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff we need to do, but what do we need to do first? Or I hate to say what's easiest, but you also made me think of something else that we've been migrating to the cloud for 20 years or now,
Right.
if you kind of look at what's going on. And it's like, okay, I've got this application that's my critical primary application, and we need to get that in the cloud. And it's like, maybe not. Maybe we start with another application and we find all the problems as we're migrating
Right.
that to the cloud. So that way, our critical application doesn't become our beta, our test case.
Well, exactly. That's why I mentioned your fifth or your 10 most critical. And this is something I've learned the hard way, because for years I tried to keep track of these things myself and it just wasn't possible. In my last job, I was able to it was kind of by accident that I was able to get a project manager named Jennifer. And I saw the difference in having a skilled, and I miss her dearly. Gosh, she was good. And this, having someone like that who can help manage all these different things that are up in the air and help take notes and scheduling and everything, and it's so critical that engineering teams need that kind of help in order to coordinate a large project like this. And so, like, if it's me, I'm calling that our critical requirement to getting anything done.
No, that's a great way to look at it,
Mhm.
because it is a project. The it's observability things. This big nebulous type thing going on. But whenever you're building your environment, and everybody has it, it's all a migration because everybody has pieces of it right now. So
Right.
building an observability architecture environment, it's a migration from what you have to where you're going. But it's a project, and that's probably the important thing to look at. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how we launch new projects.
Right.
And it's not you wait until everything is perfect. You get a minimum viable product. what's going to work? What do we know it's going to work? And obviously that's going to get better, and I'm going to tweak it. I'm going to do things going forward. But I need to get something out there so I can kind of see what's happening, get more input from obviously our customers and other people looking at that. And then we can make it better and better and better. And I think that's part of what we're doing with the whole idea of an observability architecture is I can get some major pieces up there and then learn from that and then tweak it as we go forward. Once again, you've got the governance and,
Mhm.
where am I going to store all this stuff? There's a lot of things in there we still need to talk about, but
Right.
I like that approach. And this is about, you know, not getting hung up on the minutia, but let's kind of get the big stuff done and kind of see where we're going and
Right.
then fit in the other pieces.
Yeah, and the minutia is important, but you have to
It
manage
is.
you have to manage those details. Like, for example, once you've established your requirements, you've established your data. So, for example, does my application contain the 5 data sources, or AKA golden signals? Then you get into the minutia of how do you then collect that signal and then make that signal useful, because that's also going to involve particularly talking to the application teams about behavior. I'll never forget finding out, because I was like, okay, we have batch applications, we have online applications, and then I discovered we had an application that was literally online batch, and I was like, what? And
What do I
so
do with that one?
yeah, and so then that's where it's these things that you don't necessarily know about that only the application teams know about, and that's where then it requires working with them to understand, because the essence of observability is understanding, is insight into behavior. And so if you have an application that works in a weird way like online batch, I mean, that's two very contrasting terms. And so, we talked to the application team and we figured something out. We never would have figured that out in a million years otherwise.
No, that's interesting because looking at the left-hand column right now there, those are, and there's probably others, but that's pretty much what's generating the data, what's creating the data. And at that point, you need to figure out, as you just said, what is being generated, what part of it do I actually need, what is a normal condition for this. Obviously server farms and databases are data, but the applications and network devices, obviously agents and containers and stuff, what are they generating? Why do I need to see that? And what's normal? And we discussed this in a previous one of building a baseline, which kind of goes back to what you just said. What is
Mhm.
the appropriate behavior for that stuff?
Right.
How far does it have to get off that rail before it's inappropriate behavior? What's that gap between normal, the typical, ebbs and flows of it, and what becomes a problem?
Yeah, totally. And then that gives you that ability to then, do what you need to do to get those results, and then get that data over to where you need it. One thing you always have to be also really aware of is just very different needs. And for example, security versus IT versus app support are going to have a very different set of needs and more exacting requirements as well. And so from a project management standpoint, that's super important. That's why I highly recommend separating those streams of work, because I'm not sure you're going to have much crossover.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about before. Is once again using
Yeah.
the 5 teams of above is discuss with them, because a lot of times they're looking at a lot of the same data but maybe for different purposes. And as
Right.
you just said, some of these organizations, the data is extremely time sensitive. If I've got to capture all this and save it for compliance reasons or whatever, I stick it in a bucket, it's fine. But I can't stick it in a bucket if it's stuff that I need to know. Something happened 2 minutes ago, and maybe I need to know that right now. And
Right.
some of these teams are concerned about that. Other teams, not necessarily. It's just data that I'm going to use for something in the future.
I mean, great contrast is, for example, firewall logs. So you're going to have a network team that's going to be looking at firewall logs to say, is a customer able to get through this firewall, through this VPN circuit, through this WAN to this application? Where you have a security team that's trying to use that logging to understand, are the right people getting from this VPN through our WAN to the right application? And so it's a couple of word differences there, but it's important distinctions. And so how you would use that data, what you would do with that data, are very different.
Yeah, that's kind of a good point. Is that obviously in public facing organizations where customers are connecting and shopping carts and all that type stuff, I want things to happen as quickly as possible to keep the customer as happy as
Oh, exactly.
possible, so they do it. Then on the other side of the house, there's the security side, and it's like I want to let as few people in. I want to validate. I want to authenticate. I want to, and give me some time to do this. So it's a, I don't know if there's a happy medium in there, but it's I
Yeah.
just I remember my way back when my firewall days and stuff, and it was like a constant battle that you start with nothing, everything's
Right.
closed, and then you don't start with it open and close bad things. You start with it closed and open things that had to be open. And in some cases, dealing with customers, like, I'm going to leave all this closed and somebody complains that
Yeah.
it's not open, and that'll
Right.
open the port rather than opening things I'm not quite sure why I'm opening them.
Oh, sure. And those are those just very different ways of looking at things. I mean, another good example, talking about shared data, WAF data. So web application firewall data is a good example of, typically that's a security tool. But what happens if your WAF is blocking your customer access, but the data from the WAF is only going to the security team? So the security team is not necessarily looking at blocks. It's not necessarily part of the application flow. So now you have the operations team who has a ticket from a customer that says, I can't get your applications. And that means typically the operations team now has to go page the WAF team or the security on call to figure out what's going on. And this can create constant escalations. And so this is another example of, how do you manage what should be shared data, but in a lot of ways can't be shared data, because that WAF is going to contain data that the operations team is not allowed to see. And so that's another just great example of, common data that even can't be shared, unlike, let's say, firewall logs.
No, that's actually a great point, because it kind of takes us a little bit now into the middle, and the whole idea of an observability pipeline. There's a lot of different terms for it
Right.
and whatever, and that's interesting that the data coming from, let's just say, that firewall, whatever you're talking about, that some of that data in its pure raw format needs to go to security people. They need to see who, what, when, where, why, and all that stuff. But then maybe a subset of that would go to the SRE or the IT ops people, indicating that there's latency, delay, something like that, so they
Right.
know real time. It's always better to know before the customer knows that you've got a
Oh,
problem.
exactly. Now, what I've seen done for something like this that's fairly successful is splitting up the message that says, IP customer this has been blocked. That also contains sensitive data. Use your observability pipeline to essentially split it up. So that way you're sending the full event to the security team, but you're sending the just the block information and the source IP to the operations team. So that way they get insight into who's being blocked, but you're not risking exposing sensitive data.
No, that's a great point. And which kind of takes us to one of the other blocks on there, the one just below the observability pipeline,
Exactly.
is, where does the data go? I mean, we kind of
Right.
talked about this from the very beginning, that everything on the left plus every IoT device out there, whatever, is generating something.
Mhm.
And let's just be honest, we've reached the point that we can collect, and we generate, collect, and move more data than we can ever analyze. So it's a matter of figuring out what's important to who, and that goes very back to where we really started with, what are we trying to do here?
Right.
But then what do we save? Obviously, different organization across the top. Once again, it's the same thing, is that if I, for compliance reasons, governance reasons, whatever, there might be data that I need to save for 3, 5, 7 years or whatever, just because that's the corporate policy, or the organization I'm in has that policy. But you can't necessarily save everything. Well, I guess you could if you got enough a budget there.
Right.
But how do you figure out, you know, you don't want to, the whole idea of observability data lake is that I don't want to store everything in my systems analysis. Can I do that? Yeah, if you've got an unbelievably large budget. But I need to actually split it up, as you just said, send the right data to the right place at the right time, but then keep another copy of it somewhere else, wherever.
Right. And then that's where I think that observability data lake comes in. And that's also another topic of governance. Data lake conversations kind of drive me crazy, because unfortunately, most data lakes, when you look at the architects, I mean, there's one on LinkedIn who especially annoys me, just talking about it. I can use my data lake to solve all your problems. And it just forgetting to mention that most people who would be using this tooling are not data people. They're not data scientists, and so a lot of the concepts in the data lake community don't translate well. They're not particularly usable, and that's always one of the challenges. That if, as an organization, if you're going to bring in data lakes in order to solve these problems, you have to make sure that there's processes in place to make them usable. Because from a financial standpoint, a lot of the data, what the economics around modern cloud data lakes, you get the ability to basically pay for utilization, so it can be very economical, and you can solve a lot of problems, and help people in a lot of ways, and also manage your budget. But you have to make sure that you have the right teams in place to take advantage of it. I was engaging with someone on Twitter, and we were talking about there was talking about a popular cloud data lake, and I was like, the number one requirement is you need someone who knows how to use it, someone who can build content, and then also spend the money on training. Because if you don't, you're not going to get a lot of value out of it. And so it's really important. I mean, it cuts both ways. Solve a lot of problems, but you got to make sure that you have the right skill sets.
Also,
Mm-hmm.
the tools. If maybe you need to think about abstracting like the data lake from the analysis. I mean, if you look at the going all the way to the right, your systems of analysis, your SIMs, your whatever, typically they have data stored somewhere. I'm using that term stored
Right.
just generically, wherever it happens to be. But typically it's specific to them. The whole idea of an observability data lake is that your tools over on the right side should be able to access the appropriate data at the appropriate time without having to be a cloud expert, so to speak. And
Right.
it, once again, you kind of go back, if you've been in this industry long enough, it triggers stuff in the back of your brain that go, we went through this 15 years ago, or whatever. Because
Sure.
I remember many, many years ago, they used to have something, they started to do the cloud, and they called things the walled garden. The
Right.
whole idea is that you would have something in the middle, but then you'd have interfaces to other applications that can reach in and reach out. And I'm almost thinking, is that the direction we're going long term, that I can have this, I don't want to call inexpensive, but less expensive place to store your data, but
Right.
all your high-end systems over on the right have access to that data and can pull back just the specific stuff they need as needed.
Right, and I think that's that part of managing your data, giving that right access, and then governance. Because there's definitely some options. There's definitely ways to to do exactly what you're talking about.
Looking at all this, and I know different organizations have different
Mm-hmm.
requirements, security requirements, or whatever. Does essentially this all become the cloud at some point?
And if you can, but just I think always got to in terms of being realistic, most organizations are always going to have an on-prem element, and so you can leverage cloud with your organization to get the most value, but it's just you always have to plan for the complexities of what we now call legacy, and because it's just I don't think we're still going to have significant amount of IT assets that are not in the cloud.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I don't think, ever going to go away, because if you look over on the left again, the bottom four blocks can easily migrate to the cloud depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But then the top two can't. I mean, one of the things that we talk about at
Mm-hmm.
Cribble, and once again, this is all vendor neutral type stuff, is you've got hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of endpoints, laptops, pieces of hardware,
Right.
and network devices that are generating knowledge that you might want. What's happening on that for compliance reasons and others, and that's never going to get in the cloud. Well, I shouldn't say that. Who knows what the future holds? But the whole idea is that you will always have components, and once again, as far as Cribble concerned, you've got hybrid type of environments out there where you will always have those devices that you can't ignore them. And obviously there's a lot of concerns associated with them. We work with companies, and some of the companies on this call right now, you might deal with what's typically referred to as air gap or,
Right.
compartmented type stuff. And that may have some data that you might want to get out, but depending on the rules and what kind of data it is and where you do the filtering on stuff, it might never get there. So
Totally. Well, Perry, we're running up against time. So do you want to sum up the conversation and close us out?
well, to sum it all up is Nobody's architecture is going to be the same. Everybody has a component already. The issue right now, and if you're gonna, if you're taking a working from a clean whiteboard and saying, we've got a bunch of stuff here. We don't really have something that we classify as observability. We got a lot of monitoring. We got a lot of data. We got a lot of systems. Do we want to build this together? You actually want to kind of step back and, as Ed said at the very beginning, okay, talk to your teams. What do you guys need? Not what you want. What do you need? And then what do you have already? And then how are we going to get to where do we want to get to in 6 months, a year, 18 months? As he mentioned at the very beginning, I'm going to move 1,000 apps into the cloud. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm probably going to be long since retired by then. Maybe my kids will be retired by then. But and set up plan that's doable, that's accomplishable. And I never thought about it until Ed and I didn't really plan this. The whole idea is you don't necessarily, unless it's a critical thing, and something, you don't necessarily start with the biggest challenge. You start with something that's accomplishable, and then maybe that will reduce some of the challenges of those other ones further up the stack.
That's well said. And Perry, this is why you are Dr. Observability. And I appreciate
Ed, thank you
that.
very much. I appreciate this. I appreciate I hate to tell you guys this, but Ed and I talk like this all the time. We just happen to be on camera right now, so
Perry's
it's kind of fun to do it.
No, it's always fun, Perry. Hey, I look forward to doing this again really soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
So have a great afternoon, everyone. Please take a look at Cribble. Look at Cribble sandboxes at cribble.io/sandboxes. Also sandboxes.cribble.io. Please consider joining our community at cribble.io/community. Join our Slack channel. Perry and I are available on social media. We're there in the social media. We're also at the Slack channel. So we are here to help. We'd love to talk. Even, we'll get to know each other. We'll bring you on the show.
And don't forget Cribble University too. We've got a whole curriculum of training, 100% free. Will always be 100% free. To learn about it, some of it obviously is product specific, but other it is just agnostic, vendor neutral type stuff on observability.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And thanks. That's a good call out. I'm especially just the idea of great training that comes with the product. You can't beat that.
Absolutely not.
All right. Take care. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Ed.